Hi, in this video we're beginning a two-part series or two-part section on sovereign credit analysis. So this video will be focused purely on analyzing all the factors influencing the credit risk associated with buying sovereign debt, that is debt issued by countries, whereas in the next video we'll tackle debt or the credit risk of debt issued by not specifically sovereign issuers, but those related to them. So like treasury-linked agencies, supranational organizations. This is a very theoretical topic. There's nothing quantitative about it, and actually, it's one of those videos which you probably only need to watch once. You'll get everything, and then you can move on to more challenging ideas as well. Right, so obviously, when it's debt issued by a government, which is what sovereign credit is all about, debt issued by governments, well, that brings along its own sort of unique challenges, its own unique concepts. Governments, as you will very well know, conduct fiscal policy in a country, in some area of authority. They basically provide access to various public goods and services for the citizens, provide public goods and services, and those could be things like infrastructure, roads, for example, health, healthcare, education services, and that's what the money is essentially mainly spent on, whereas the revenue or the source of repayments in the case of governments, primary source of repayments is going to be things like taxes and other government revenue. It's not just taxes. Governments can generate other forms of revenue as well, other government revenue. For example, they may get dividends from companies which they own that are state controlled, or they may sell licenses to companies who want to, for example, operate, let's say, phone networks in a country, things like that. And because a government, essentially in, I guess, everywhere around the world, governments have the authority. They can impose taxes, obviously within their jurisdiction. That means they are the lowest credit risk issuer. That's what they are deemed to be, lowest credit risk in a given country. That kind of is assumed. Obviously, sometimes that doesn't work when a country goes bust, and potentially a company may be less risky than the government of the country in which that company operates, but the government will typically be the lowest credit risk in a given country, and we will assume that in the case of developed markets, well, that is the assumption we typically make, the government is described as a default risk-free issuer. Basically, we assume them to be free of the risk of default, which is a bit of a simplification. There's always an element of default risk or credit risk involved, even if it is the government. But in developed countries, this assumption is definitely typically made. Okay, well, when we try to assess, so over here let me write assessment of the credit worthiness, worthiness of a government, how good it is as an issuer. When we try to assess this, there are two sets of factors that we typically take into account. They are qualitative factors and quantitative factors. And the rest of this quantitative factors, the rest of this video will be a discussion of both sets of factors, one by one. You kind of have to understand what each of them are, what they mean. Self-explanatory, to be honest, but sometimes without watching or listening to a video like this, you may not precisely pinpoint which one does what. There are going to be 5 of these qualitative factors, so we're going to start with the qualitative ones. Of course, fortunately there are less quantitative factors, I think only 3, and there's going to be 5 of them. Now you don't need to necessarily know them off by heart, just be able to identify which one does what. Qualitative factors over here, and let's start off, number 1, with government institutions and policy. Government institutions and policy. Okay, and this is all about the role that government institutions and that government policy, their role in providing for a stable political and economic environment. So their role in ensuring political and economic, basically, stability. Right, so this could be pretty basic things, quite fundamental ideas and concepts, such as whether a country has the institutions and the policies to ensure that there is a rule of law, that you can trust the law to be obeyed and to be executed, or things like ensuring property rights. Can you be confident that in a given country your right to property, be it tangible or for that matter intellectual, which is a bit more difficult, will that be respected? And there are also the less basic ones, sort of the more sophisticated ones, as I will call them. Your book doesn't necessarily use this phrase, more sophisticated, right? Things like quality of financial reporting. That also comes, quality of financial reporting, that also comes about as a consequence of having institutions and policies which, ensure that financial reporting standards are upheld. Quality of financial reporting, transparency of business, things like that. This list is definitely just the beginning. Now, also belonging to this category is something like lack of political, or for that matter military conflicts, but lack of conflicts with neighboring countries. Conflicts with neighbors, I mean neighboring nations, neighboring countries, but also, very importantly, if you're going to buy public debt or sovereign debt, the government's willingness to pay back on its promises, to pay back on its debt. How likely is the government to not just be able to pay, but want to pay? And this links to a very important concept which you need to definitely know about, and kind of jot down this name, something called sovereign immunity. And it is important, let me stress this, okay, sovereign immunity. Well, basically, if you are an investor who's bought some government debt, especially of a foreign nation, you have very limited power to force a government to do something to ensure you get paid. So investors have absolutely what we would describe as limited ability or limited power, unless you're very big as an investor and very powerful, to force a government to, do what a normal company would do, declare bankruptcy if they're unable to pay. And typically declaring bankruptcy would then force some kind of liquidation of its assets. And those, the proceeds from the liquidation of the assets would be used to settle the borrower's debt, the debt that is outstanding. This would happen in the case of a company if it was unable to pay, if it defaulted on its debt. Obviously, providing the institutions are there, the courts, etc., are there to carry this out. In the case of a country, you can't force it to go bankrupt. You can't force it to sell its assets. So unlike corporations, sovereign issuers enjoy a level of immunity, and that means there are limits to the legal recourse, the ability to go back and force the borrower to do something. In most cases, if a government does indeed default on its debt, the borrowers will often work together with the debtor, the country, to negotiate some kind of debt restructuring, prolongation maybe of the term to maturity, or perhaps very often a lowering of the face value of the debt. And that is a complicated process nevertheless. But bear in mind this phrase, sovereign immunity. It may come up as in a theoretical question. Right. So we've had government, institutions, and policy as our first qualitative factor. Now the next one is going to be called fiscal flexibility. And this is basically, this is all about assessing, so it's an assessment of that country's fiscal discipline. And fiscal discipline, discipline. Fiscal discipline is all about how well a country is able to collect taxes and how well it enforces taxes. Because it's all good having taxes on paper if then subsequently that taxpayers are quite effective at dodging the payment of those taxes. So enforceability of the tax collection mechanism on the one hand, but then within fiscal discipline, you've got the other side of the equation. The budgetary equation is where the money goes to. So allocation of budget expenditure, and of course you will know stories of budgets being misspent, sometimes in a very, very fraudulent way by those close to politics. So expenditure on the one hand, tax collection on the other, and also, fiscal policy and therefore fiscal discipline is also about managing the country's outstanding debt. So, but I guess all of these kind of feed together and off one another. So this is a fairly simple point. The third one is monetary effectiveness. Okay. Now this is all about the central bank and its role in the economy. So, as you will already know, probably, what the central bank does is it, via a number of tools, it tries to influence central banks try to influence the quantity of money in the economy. And therefore also the sort of the level or the volume of credit, or via credit they try to influence the quantity of money, or the two are linked, amount of credit in a given economy. And by virtue of doing this, they also try to stabilize inflation or inflation expectations. Now, the way central banks do this, the tools which they use are things like short-term, so ST, short-term interest rates. They set interest rates, short-term ones in the economy. They also set the minimum reserve requirements, which are forced on banks. This is how much money they, as a minimum, have to keep at the central bank. We've talked about these when discussing short-term debt issuance by financial institutions, as well as repo transactions. And what they also do is they conduct open market operations, which is the buying and selling of debt securities, of bonds in the market. Now, the primary goal here is with these tools they try to influence the quantity amount of money and the amount of credit in the economy, but this is all done with a view for the primary goal of for most central banks, and that is to keep inflation under control. So the goal is price stability, or relative price stability. We typically want a moderate amount of inflation to be in place. And typically central banks also have a secondary goal. Now, the way this is officially worded is different country by country, but they also want to typically promote stable economic growth, sustainable, stable growth. And, by looking at a country's central bank and its actions and its decisions and the results of those decisions, you can check how effective a given central bank is in trying to achieve these aims, especially maintaining price stability and promoting growth. And one very key thing that investors definitely look at is when looking at a given country and its situation is the idea or the notion of central bank independence. Because if a central bank is not independent of politics, i.e. those politicians who on a day-to-day basis are responsible for conducting fiscal policy, it is very easy to get entangled in a cycle of increasing money supply, sort of what we often term as printing money or making money cheap by keeping interest rates low. And that very often creates trouble down the road in the form of high inflation, which tends to run away in a sort of spiral fashion. And also your domestic currency will suffer depreciation relative to other countries. And if you need to import a lot of stuff like fuel, for example, that will propel inflation even further. So it's a good idea. That's what we think in economics, for central banks to have a level of independence, quite a high level of independence from government, because the decisions taken by central banks, especially when it comes to potentially increasing short-term interest rates, so as to lower the quantity of money in the economy and potentially cool the economy down if it's overheated, are not going to be popular. And if you're a politician, this is not how you win elections. So central banks need to be independent of politicians to take those sometimes unpopular, but I guess needed steps. Right, our next point on the list is going to be something called economic flexibility. And this point is not to do with fiscal policy. it's more about the country's economy, meaning its businesses. And it's not just about the size of the economy here that matters, it's more to do with the degree to which that economy is diversified, degree of economic diversification. And it also is growth potential. I mean, if you've got an economy with a high level of diversification and good growth potential, that's absolutely brilliant from the point of view of investors investing in your sovereign debt. Those are good signs. Obviously, the problem, and we have picked up on this, I did mention this a couple of times already, I think, in previous videos, is that in the case of emerging economies, obviously not all, but a lot of the emerging economies around the world are often very undiversified. Economies are often the opposite of being diversified. They're often dependent on a single industry, for example, often a single commodity, some kind of natural resource. And as a result of this, they're going to be very sensitive. So therefore, highly sensitive to economic fluctuation, which causes the demand for that resource, that industry's output, or that commodity to fluctuate as well. So to economic fluctuation, so basically the economic cycle, right, globally, commodity prices going up and down, fluctuation, stuff like that, or trade interruptions. Think about COVID. What happens when logistics come to a halt globally and you can't export your goods or your commodities, or it's trade interruptions? That's going to be terrible for your economy if it's not diversified. If you, on the other hand, have a more diversified economy and you, for example, have a well-developed services sector, then maybe it will not be so bad, because services can be rendered irrespective of trade interruptions, right? Obviously, there are political events which may make that more difficult, but generally speaking, services are good because they don't rely on a logistical chain which may come to a halt. Okay, the other problem with these single industry or single commodity economies, they often have fewer trading partners. So it's also about having a more or less diversified trading partner base, or sort of importer base, because if you rely on a single big or a couple of big buyers for your commodities, maybe some very big powerful companies or nations, well, that doesn't make you crisis proof at all. Now, the other thing I just want to mention about emerging economies, and I guess this will be quite obvious as well, is that they often will be associated, so they may have a relatively large, what we call informal economy. So that's the unregistered part of business activity, which means it's difficult to collect taxes, difficult to tax, because this goes unreported, the grey economy or the informal economy. Right, and for the fifth and final of the, remember where we are talking about the 5 so-called qualitative factors when examining the credit risk of sovereign issuers. The 5th one is external status. Okay, so This comes as a result of your position in terms of international trade, how important you are as a trading partner to the rest of the world, but also, very importantly, foreign exchange policy, which will impact your ability to service debt. And one of the most important things here is this gets simplified pretty much to a very easy to appreciate point. Is your country's currency considered to be a reserve currency? So let me ask this, or let me put this down by writing reserve currency status question mark. So is your currency, your own currency, a reserve currency? A reserve currency is enjoyed by those currencies that are going to be fully convertible into other currencies, so without any limits, and also, very importantly, held by foreign central banks and generally by foreign investors. And typically it's the currencies of those countries who are big in terms of international trade that are held as reserve currency at the central bank, held by foreign central banks and other investors as well, like funds, etc. And if your currency is indeed a reserve currency for others, so let me say, if this is indeed true, well, from that comes the benefit that the government can definitely issue more debt in its own domestic currency. And you can issue more debt in your own domestic currency because, you will have foreign investors who will likely want to buy that debt because they appreciate holding debt which is denominated in that currency because they treat it as a reserve currency. So as I told you, I think on numerous occasions already, where I come from, Poland, the Polish central bank holds reserves in things like US dollar or the euro or the Swiss franc, all of those being important currencies from the point of view of trade that is conducted by my country with the rest of the world. It's typically settled in the USD or the euro or indeed the Swiss franc, and the central bank doesn't just hold currency, it actually invests that currency into debt securities issued by the governments of the relevant countries, be they the United States or perhaps Germany, France, etc., for the euro, or the Swiss government. So if your currency is indeed held as a reserve somewhere else around the world, you can be sure that there will be demand for your safe, default risk-free sovereign debt as a result of that. And you then have, as a consequence, a greater ability or greater capacity to sustain deficits, to run deficits. I mean, America uses, the United States uses this to its advantage, right? They can have a pretty big deficit. As a result, higher debt levels as a country. They're very much indebted, but still very low likelihood of default, lower likelihood of sovereign default, because you can count on investors pretty much always queuing up to buy your freshly issued government bonds. So even though you are highly indebted, the fact that they treat your currency as a reserve one means you've got a natural source of demand for that debt which you need to issue. Right, so that's external status, which completes our list of 5. Now remember, when I started about talking, let's recall when I started talking about this, we said there would be 5 qualitative factors, and an additional, I think I said perhaps 3, quantitative factors. It is indeed 3 quantitative factors. So let's now move on to those. This will, complete the lesson more or less. So quantitative factors now. Of which there are indeed 3. The first one, these are quantitative, so they will involve numbers, they will involve metrics, ratios. You don't have to compute anything here, we'll just talk about them sort of theoretically. This is more about estimating, the ability to pay off debt, so trying to quantify things. The first one is fiscal strength. Remember that in the qualitative factors we had fiscal flexibility, which is all about assessing the discipline of the public finances. Here it's measuring the fiscal strength, and I know the two kind of may seem very much overlapping, and they indeed are. So this is not a very sort of strict analysis. It's absolutely normal to think about them at the same time. Right, so what we will typically calculate here is something like the debt burden on a country, and of course if the debt burden is higher, that means the country's credit quality is effectively lower. The way we measure this is typically by calculating things like the amount of public debt relative to something like GDP, or perhaps the amount of debt relative to the tax revenue, or generally the revenue generated by a country. And this is similar to leverage measures, which you would calculate for a company. Another thing that we may measure here, so not just debt burden, but also how much budget deficit there is, or indeed how much surplus there may be in terms of budget as a percentage of the country's GDP. And how much surplus or negative deficit are we running compared to our country's GDP. And this is going to be an indicator of how the debt burden is changing, so of whether the debt burden, the thing we had at the top, is either improving or indeed whether it is deteriorating. Okay, and it's a signal or a measure of fiscal discipline. So once again, a throwback to the previous idea of fiscal discipline under fiscal flexibility that we discussed under qualitative factors. So that was debt burden over here. One more is going to be debt affordability. And this is a bit like debt coverage for that we discussed previously with companies, or it's a similar measure. It's not constructed in the same way, but we will be looking at things like interest to GDP. How much interest a government has to pay on its debt relative to its GDP, or how much interest it has to pay relative to its revenue. And of course, if the amount of interest here is relative to GDP or revenue, if it's higher, then it's a sign of lower credit quality. As I said, it's not a direct reflection of or mirror image of how we measure coverage, but in the case of companies, but debt coverage. But your book talks about it as being akin or similar to coverage. Okay, well, let's go to the next one: economic growth. This is going to be more sort of, I guess, straightforward. Economic growth and economic stability. Previously we discussed things like under qualitative factors we talked about economic flexibility, how diversified an economy is, how what its growth potential is. Well, here it's just about growth and stability, but quantified. And the idea is that a wealthier economy, a more stable economy, is typically better regarded as better positioned to withstand shocks, right? So how are we going to measure this? Well, we're going to look at things, measures of economic growth, but also volatility. So over here, real, that is inflation adjusted GDP growth. And you may average this out over a number of periods. Your book does indeed talk about average real GDP growth. I just wrote real GDP growth because if you average something out, it's pretty much the same measure, but a bit more sophisticated. But also real GDP growth volatility, how it changes from period to period. So typically here you'll be using something like standard deviation of that GDP growth to see what the amount of variance is over time. So, okay, measuring growth and volatility. Another idea is just measure the size and the scale of the economy. That's even simple. You're not focusing on the dynamic, you just want a pure number. So you measure something like GDP, pure and simple, or per capita, that's GDP per person, per capita GDP. Very simple macroeconomic measures, nothing fancy over here. Right, so that's economic growth and stability. Now, for the third and final of these external measures, not external measures, quantitative factors that we take into account when conducting a sovereign credit analysis, is external stability. Now, this isn't all that straightforward when you just look at the name. This is once again a throwback to the idea of other investors around the world willing to hold your country's currency as part of their reserves and therefore willing to perhaps buy your bonds. Now, let me phrase this: depends on whether foreign investors are willing to hold the country's currency as reserve, as part of their reserves. You see, the problem is, if you are a country that doesn't enjoy reserve currency status, so let me say, if this is not the case, which is true for many countries around the world, this country will have to or must generate stable foreign currency inflows to meet its interest and principal payments, to meet debt payments. Because the idea here is, if you think about a country whose currency is not readily exchangeable into other more major currencies, the only way it can tap into the global debt markets is by issuing debt, external debt, which is targeted at foreign investors and denominated, let's say, in US dollars or the euro. And in order to then service the payments, interest and principal, you need to have some access to, in some way, get your hands on that foreign currency to make those payments. And the way we measure how likely that is, what is the likelihood of a country being able to do that, is by typically looking at its currency reserves. Reserves that it holds in itself on its own. So FX reserves, foreign exchange reserves to GDP ratios, or something called the reserve ratio, which is simply the relationship of FX reserves related to the amount of external debt. That's the debt typically denominated in foreign currencies, which is sold to outside investors. Because, of course, you may say, well, what about issuing debt in your own currency? Well, that's all very good, but typically that will be addressed to domestic investors, or it will be domestic investors who primarily will be able to buy that debt. And because you're often an emerging economy in this case, that home market may not be deep enough to really borrow substantial amounts of money. Hence, you need to go outside and issue debt in a currency that is not your own. So maybe in dollars, in euros, but then you need to have inflows to be able to service the payments. A good example of a country not being able to service its external debt not so long ago was the Russian Republic, which was cut off from the dollar as a result of its actions in Ukraine, and it was unable to generate dollar inflows to make debt repayments on USD denominated bonds, and it went into default. So that's an extreme example. Now, also, once still to do with the measures are measures of external debt. How much external debt we've got, that's the one which is denominated in foreign currency. So measures like long-term debt, so external debt to GDP. This is known as the external debt burden of a country. Okay. We also have a measure that your book mentions of external debt due in the next 12 months to GDP, which is, annual GDP. And this is showing you the short-term element of your external debt as opposed to the long-term element, which needs to be serviced in the next 1 year. And that's a measure of external debt due. So you can regard these two, this one and this one, as being complements, because one focuses on the longer term stuff, the second focuses on what's coming up next. Okay, let me just make a few points to finish off with about accumulating foreign exchange reserves. Accumulating FX reserves. This is what I said often central banks do on behalf of a nation, accumulating FX reserves. Why do we need FX reserves, foreign exchange reserves? Because if we issue debt which is denominated in a foreign currency, those reserves will allow us to potentially meet the relevant payments. Now, and there are other reasons why you do it as well. How can you generate these reserves? Where do they come from? Well, they come from potentially running or operating with a current account surplus, which basically means you are exporting more than you are importing. But obviously the surplus is with developed countries. So if you as a country sell more to the US than you buy from the US, you will be receiving more dollars than you have to pay to your American counterparts, trade partners, and you'll end up running a surplus. And you may think, well, how does that end up with the central bank? Well, if you're exporting, if I'm a Polish company and I'm exporting to the US, I'll get inflows in US dollars. I may have to also import some parts, etc., and pay for them in US dollars as well. But if there's a net US dollar inflow from my export/import activity, so I've got a trade surplus, I'll typically go to the bank to then exchange those US dollars for my own currency, in which I have to, pay wages and suffer all the costs and pay taxes, etc. So that will typically trickle its way down to the central bank, and the central bank will end up with the US dollar or whatever other developed country currency reserves sitting on its account. Another way to get your hands on foreign currency is to have foreign currency remittances. So transfers back home coming from citizens working abroad. If you've got a big population of citizens who've emigrated to other countries, and those citizens do send money back home, they send the foreign currency back home, which on home ground needs to be converted into the domestic currency, and once again that leaves you with a growing US dollar or British pound or whatever euro stockpile, which ends up being held by the central bank. Obviously, it's not the central bank taking the money and in some way expropriating it. No, they're giving you the local currency instead, which you use for, which the families back home use for funding their everyday costs. And the problem is over here that if you are a developing country, an emerging sort of market nation, this may come, something we've talked about before, may come from exporting commodities, especially some single commodity that you rely on, which you have by nature of your geography, and then this may be heavily impacted by economic conditions in the market, whether people do want to buy your commodity prices, etc., etc. So those reserves may not be very stable. They may fluctuate as a result of this. Reserves may fluctuate as a result of demand being unstable and commodity prices being unstable as well. Let me just say here that many countries who rely on certain commodities, this is especially true for oil-producing countries, oil and gas-rich countries, what they often do, and this is a sensible long-term policy, is the surpluses which they generate, the foreign currency surpluses which they generate from being net exporters, at least partially typically go into what we call sovereign wealth funds, SWFs. And those sovereign wealth funds, and you'll see many of the Middle Eastern countries or Far Eastern, Southeast Asian countries like Singapore establishing sovereign wealth funds. Norway has a huge sovereign wealth fund, which was funded and still is funded by the surpluses from exports of oil or gas, natural gas. That goes into special sovereign wealth funds, whose job is then to invest that money wisely. And a lot of those countries invest that money into diversifying their economies away from the commodity base on which they currently rely, knowing that those commodities will run out, but they want to use the funds to kind of sensibly develop other industries as well.